Anybody, if you enjoy the kind of content I want to share, then feel free to pop onto our website, cdahealingarts.com, and we'll have the content uploaded to there. So I'm Dr. Hunter Peterson. I'm the clinic director at Coeur d'Alene Healing Arts. I'm a naturopathic physician. And we do these online open forums every month alternating between myself and Dr. Karen, another one of our doctors here at the clinic. And this time is designated to kind of peek into health topics that we find would be interesting to our patients. And it's really an opportunity to expand and open up into your particular curiosities as well, not just simply to listen to me chat at you. So I do want to really encourage everybody on this call, if you'd like. I think what does work best is to use the chat feature, which is on the bottom bar. There's a little icon there. And if you pop a chat up, then I'll be able to grab those questions kind of in stride of things, or catch it if later on if I know I'm going to cover it. So today's topic, as we launch in, is going to be talking about food allergies and intolerances. And as a naturopathic doctor, our food as medicine is a very critical component of what contributes or detracts from our health. And so understanding food relationships on a very personalized level is really important to me. And I think, with a theme of individualized and comprehensive person-centered medicine at our clinic, then we like to extend that concept into nutritional selection. So when we talk about food intolerances and food allergies, I think terminology is really important, because there's a lot of confusion about what a food intolerance or a food allergy is. And I really look at them as pretty distinctive concepts. And I want to kind of start by getting real clear about that. So first of all, we're starting with the premise that not all food is equally good or bad for all people. There's a couple of exceptions that I would definitely put out there in terms of foods that are pretty universally bad for all people. I would say fried foods in general are not really healthy to anybody. I'd similarly say really refined sugars, candy and all of their relatives, that refined sugar is pretty harmful to our physiology on a lot of levels. And I, generally think that we'd all stand to do better to have less of it in our lives. So there are some general nutritional principles that nobody's body is really going to respond well to those types of foods, especially when eaten regularly. But then we get into this whole other topic of foods that are intrinsically healthy may not be friendly or healthy for individuals. And really, the process of how we go about figuring that out is something that I like to do with a lot of folks, and is the kind of main avenue of this conversation, to kind of talk through all the different possibilities, approaches. And there's probably many more that I won't talk about, but I want to go through the ones most familiar to me, the ones I have the most experience with. And so let's do that defining of food allergies and food intolerances. So the big differentiation of that definition for me is that food intolerances, generally speaking, there are exceptions, but generally speaking, are foods that you will always have a disturbing effect on your health if consumed frequently or in large quantities. So in other words, these are we would call them innate. We are basically born with them, and they will always be true our entire lives. Now, the severity of how the intolerance manifests in our body, in terms of how disturbing it is to our health has to do with a lot of factors. It has to do with our age, our vitality, how inflamed our immune system is, how intact our digestive processes are. And those will dictate how intensively a food intolerance may aggravate one's health. But generally, that's a key distinction, is those intolerances are innate and they will always be true. And generally, this is again a generalization, it's not always true, but generally, intolerances to foods are not really rapid onset in their symptom expression. Most intolerances are what we call cumulatory. So it means that you will not typically have an initial really robust symptom response when you consume a food you're intolerant to. That's also not always true. You definitely can have an immediate response to foods you're intolerant to. But that's a little different than a food allergy, which in my experience tends to present symptomatically much more aggressively and immediately when an exposure to a food happens. So that's another significant differentiating point. Of course, that really makes food intolerances a little trickier to spot and identify if the adverse response to the food is not immediate. Allergies, on the other hand, the distinguishing features of food allergies are that they are an immediate typical aggravating response to a food. The pathways that are at play in an allergy tend to mount a pretty immediate immune response to foods. Those can be various, and we will talk about them, but they usually happen pretty quickly, and sometimes they can be pretty extreme. Allergies also, as a defining point, are acquired. In other words, it's almost not impossible, but it's exceedingly unlikely to be born with an allergy to foods. Almost all food allergies are acquired during our lifetime. And what makes us acquire them, I mean, there's a little genetic predisposition sometimes, certainly, but by and large, far and away, those allergies are acquired by inflammatory and disruptive processes originating in the gut and spanning into the immune system. So the kind of exciting news about food allergies is that they are reversible. In other words, you, through treatment and working on the underlying causes of what created the allergy, they can be resolved. And so I've seen that happen countless times with my patients, depending on how severe the allergy is, how long it's been around, and how compromised people's immune systems and guts are. That can take quite a long time. But I definitely have seen many times the reversal and resolution of food allergies. So that's kind of a bit of a beginning point, in terms of definitions. And we can talk about what are some typical presentations. We'll just start with allergies. So one of the most obvious ones people have heard of is, anaphylaxis, a full kind of immune overreactivity to, say, a common one is peanuts. Someone's developed an allergy to peanuts. You get peanuts on your mouth, you swallow peanuts, you eat them, and you can immediately start to swell. It's typically seen as a histamine-mediated response where swelling, redness, heat all occur, and that can happen pretty rapidly. It can happen also just exclusively on the skin. So another common food allergy reaction is hives. That's a big immediately raised rash. Many food allergy responses happen in the gut. You get immediate diarrhea, immediate abdominal pain. One common one with food allergies to eggs is unsettled stomach and nausea after eating eggs. Very common. So digestive responses are pretty common. Another thing that you will actually see happen if you take the time to do it is what's called a pulse check. And you basically check your pulse rate, how many beats per minute before you eat a meal. And then you check it after a meal. And if that rate increases by more than 50%, it's a pretty good bet there's an allergy there or possibly an intolerance. So nice little tool there too. In terms of, intolerance, this is a much broader sweep of symptom categories. Sometimes I do see, like I said, more immediate reactions, bloating in the stomach, loose stool. I will sometimes see mucousy coated throats, discharge from the sinuses. Those can be relatively common pretty quickly with intolerances, but really when it gets down to it, intolerances can contribute to an enormous amount of symptoms. And we're talking about migraine, headaches, and menstrual disturbances, and amplifying allergies and asthmas, and all sorts of gut disturbances. Eczema is a big one that's associated with it. Chronic sinus congestion, energy stuff, emotional stuff, disturbances in those realms can all relate to an intolerant food accumulating in the system and causing a really adverse, tissue response to how the immune system mounts a discharge response to remove those toxins that the body can't use from those foods. So really, almost any physiologic symptom can be associated, at least in part, if not fully, with a food intolerance. And we all have them. So it becomes a very important thing to kind of identify how well our bodies are digesting foods and what foods are friendly and unfriendly to them. So I want to, and again, please shoot messages up if anything's popping up as questions. I'm happy to answer them. So I want to talk a little bit about, the physiology of how we mount these responses, whether it's an intolerance or an allergy to foods. We'll start with allergy because it's a little more straightforward. So we have all these different parts to our immune system, and many of you are probably familiar with the term antibody, especially now that we're going through this pandemic and talking about vaccines. You're probably aware that we make antibodies as part of what's called our adaptive immune system as a protection against harmful pathogens. And those are all different types of antibodies. They are called IgA antibodies, IgE antibodies, IgG antibodies. And so we want to kind of be curious about, that response and how that develops. And it turns out that with allergies, what's happened there is our immune system has developed an IgE response to a particular food. Now, if everything's all happy in our guts, in our immune systems, we tend to develop what's called an IgA or a tolerance response to foods, but mostly it's tolerance. We don't really make a lot of antibodies to foods if that food is friendly and being digested and assimilated appropriately. So when we develop allergies, it's very common to see associated with it an IgE antibody. And what that means is we've basically prepped up this immune response to that food. And when that parts of that food get introduced into our bloodstream, or even in our gut, but mostly our bloodstream, we ratchet up this immune response to go scavenge and get rid of that substance. And that leads to an inflammatory type of process with, again, the classic things: heat, swelling, redness, pain, all can be things associated with that, and some of the symptoms I mentioned. So, of course, the real key question is, how do you develop that response? If you don't get born with it, what creates that? And so, what I suspect, this is my hypothesis, is not set in stone, but my suspicion is that what goes on is we have this intestinal lining, the gut lining is a pretty fragile lining, and yet it is what protects the inside of our body from the gut tube and what is in the gut tube. And what's supposed to happen is we're supposed to break our foods pretty much all the way down. And then with that nice and healthy gut lining, absorb those fully digested foods into our bloodstream. And when that happens, when there's a really healthy gut lining and when there's complete digestion, those foods that are absorbed are broken down to the degree that they don't present a threat to our immune system. It's very unlikely our immune system will gauge them as hostile. And so if the conditions of digestion and assimilation are good, it's exquisitely unlikely to develop an allergy. However, when the intestinal lining starts to be inflamed and damaged, and a whole bunch of things can cause this, the wrong kind of bacteria and parasites living in our gut, eating foods that the bad bugs make a lot of toxins out of living in our gut, eating foods that are simply irritating to our intestinal lining that we don't digest fully. When we're really stressed and we don't get the nourishment and blood flow to our intestinal organs and intestinal linings that it needs, all of these things can lead to inflammation of the actual lining of the gut. And if that inflammation becomes chronic, then what often will happen is that lining will literally become leaky and damaged. So now you have a situation where those foods that you're eating, and especially if you don't have good enzyme output or you're eating foods that you don't make enzymes to digest, those foods start slipping across that leaky gut lining, that leaky membrane that's no longer sealed. And then they get into the bloodstream and the immune system starts IDing them and says, wait a second, this looks hostile. Even though it's a food, the immune system is identifying it as harmful, and it starts to adapt and build that IgE antibody response, and it tries to remove it from the system. And that process of the immune system interfacing with that incompletely digested food is what drives the symptoms of food allergies. And once that response is all built up and amped up, it can happen pretty quickly when you reintroduce a food that you're allergic to. So of course, one really simple short-term solution is, well, if you're going to cause that harmful of a response to that food, is to avoid that food. And indeed, people are told who have developed an egg allergy or a peanut allergy or an almond allergy or a tomato allergy or whatever food to avoid that food indefinitely, because when you eat it, it has this really high possibility of causing this really serious response in your immune system, whatever that's going to look like. Now, my preferred conversation around that food allergy process is, well, okay, here's how we got there, right? I just basically explained that with the inflammation of the gut lining based on all those factors and the leakiness leading to incompletely digested foods activating the immune system. So really what our work is to stop the inflammation going on in the gut, nourish the lining that's been damaged, and help our food be digested more completely so that we can have that lining become repaired. And then those food particles are not going to be leaking into the bloodstream incompletely digested. And over the course of time, this takes a while, you can actually decouple that allergy response, that IgE mediated antibody response that kicks off all that inflammation can basically diminish. And at that point, carefully reintroducing the allergen food usually leads to minimal aggravation. So that's a pretty complex process, and it's very individualized. And interestingly, people avoiding the foods they're intolerant to is one of the best ways to reverse an allergy to a different food. Lots of other factors, like I said, the bugs that live in the gut, what foods they're feeding on, what foods are going to promote the good bugs, what foods are going to promote the bad bugs. Sometimes we need to get rid of some of the bad bugs and use botanicals, etc., to kill them off. Clearly, the foods you eat and the choices there are going to have a huge influence on healing the gut. We're going to incorporate lots of useful nutrients for the gut lining. Glutamine is a great one. Bone broth is excellent for repairing the gut lining. Fresh pressed vegetable juices are excellent in that regard. One of my favorite tools is actually fasting, putting a person on digestive rest with maybe some fresh pressed vegetable juices or broths to allow space for the lining to repair. Sometimes we use probiotics or fermented foods that can kind of help inoculate the good bugs. So many, many ways to engage greater gut health. And I should not neglect, and this is a very important thing, the healthiness of the digestive organs, how efficiently your stomach is making acid, how efficiently your pancreas is making enzymes, how efficiently your gallbladder and liver are making bile, how kind of robust the blood flow is to your digestive organs. These are very critical. If those aren't there, then even eating a perfect diet can really lead to fermentation and maldigestion of foods, which of course eventually we create that leaky gut phenomenon. And guess what? If this comes as a surprise, hope it doesn't, the number one driver of this poor output to the digestive organs is our mind, our brain, and how it holds us in a state of stress or fight or flight. So certainly, the degree to which we are under psychological stress, which in our culture is kind of constant, it really tells our body to shut down all the blood flow and nerve supply to our digestive organs. So working on that concept and principle is a big, big deal with helping people restore their digestion. And something else that sometimes gets neglected, and we gloss over, but I think is such a big deal, is the hygiene of how we consume our food. So not only being relaxed when we eat our food, that's a big deal, but chewing up our food and not overeating. So many people's gut issues stem from a pattern of overeating. When we put too much in the system, it overwhelms it, especially if we have poor output of our digestive organs. So that's one of the biggest things, is to chew your food and to not eat more than your body's capable of digesting. So I am going to kind of take a moment to read these questions. I'm probably not going to talk about COVID vaccines because that's not this topic. Food intolerances. One question, does food intolerance get manifested by gas in the gut? Absolutely. That's a very, very common symptom, gas and bloating. And I'll talk a little bit about intolerances. Although, Betty, the question you have about reversing gluten intolerance, I mean, if we're using the definition of an intolerance, if you have a true gluten or wheat intolerance, then it really can't be reversed. You're always going to be aggravated if you have it too much and too frequently. Now, the type of gluten or wheat you consume has a big deal to do with how well it's tolerated. I think very few people are universally intolerant to gluten. I think what's much more common is people are intolerant to modern hybridized wheat, which has hundreds of thousands of times the gluten content as ancient grains. Almost everybody can digest wheat if it's an ancient grain. And so Ezekiel, spelt, kemut, these are all examples of ancient wheat grains that most people tolerate really well, if their gut is in a healthy working order. And that's kind of always going to be a caveat, is if the gut is healthy, right? The gut's not healthy, then all sorts of foods become allergies and intolerances because the gut lining is leaky and we're not breaking them down completely. And it's revving up our immune systems. So another question that got popped out there is, why do we have cravings for things that are clearly unhealthy? A few answers. One is this beautiful thing called habit and addiction. You know, basically, when we reinforce a pathway over and over and over, we start to unconsciously crave it. And that's alcohol, that's caffeine, that's tobacco, that's, you know, going for a walk after work, which is a good addiction to have. But, you know, sugar is no different. Sugar is also kind of interesting because it actually, the bad bugs that are causing issues in our gut really like to metabolize sugar. And when you feed them a lot of sugar, you grow the bad bugs, and those bad bugs communicate to your brain and actually reinforce the craving pathway, which is really a bummer. But the exciting thing there too is if you break the chain and break the cycle and really unwind that problem with the bugs in the gut, then you can really remove a lot of those cravings, which is very nice. Other foods like dairy, kind of similar story, a little bit different twist. Some of the compounds in dairy actually bind up to opiate receptors in our brains. So in terms of if you got a leaky gut and you're eating a lot of dairy, one of the things it can do is kind of literally hit those receptors that kind of bring us a sense of euphoria, transiently, of course, but that's one of the mechanisms by which kind of cravings happen. And honestly, like, to be really just blunt and broad, I see all sorts of cravings associated with emotional patterns of soothing. So a lot of times when people are not feeling okay emotionally, angry, overwhelmed, exhausted, irritated, agitated, overstimulated, then oftentimes people will literally use foods to kind of soothe the kind of experience they're having around those emotions. And that's pretty universal too. So those are some of the things I have noticed associated with cravings. So a few more answers since there's more questions popping up. So with ancient grains, I don't necessarily think they need to be sprouted. If any food that is sprouted is easier to digest. So just as a concept, if you're willing to take the time to sprout things, or you have a source of sprouted foods, think of it as like kind of already pre-digested. That's nice. But you do not need that with ancient grains, in my opinion. A question about digestive efficiency. Yeah, I did kind of cover that a bit. You know, basically what we're talking about there, we're talking about the stress response for sure, and really working that on a causative level. We're talking about enzymes. I use several at the clinic to help the pancreas. We're talking about stomach acid, bitters, or actually hydrochloric acid, sometimes apple cider vinegar. Often we're using bile salts to help essentially help out the gallbladder and liver emulsify and digest fats. We're talking about food hygiene and chewing food. I like to use other tools like castor oil packs and Sometimes I suggest electrotherapy or sine wave over the abdomen to kind of bring more nerve flow. So lots and lots of ways to work on that efficiency. Um, yeah, those are a few. Um, Another question about um, fasting from dinner to breakfast, is that enough to help prepare the gut? Well, sure. I mean, having a good 12-hour fast overnight is good for the gut. Um, when I more talk about like actively repairing the gut via fasting, I'm usually working off prolonged fasts. So I'm usually doing, 5 to 7 days, on average. And usually we modify that so there's a little smoothie, something to keep your bowels going. And usually we're using juices or broths broths with no fiber. But the idea is you want sustained, you know, rest to the gut to really work on it on like a clinical therapeutic level. But yeah, it's like a good practice every day. Pausing for 12 hours overnight is great. And I really recommend that to everybody. Um, so yeah, I think that those are answering most of the questions. I don't think you need to drink water 30 minutes before a meal. In fact, I tell people generally try to stay away from liquids an hour on either side of meal, plus very small amount during a meal because it dilutes digestive juices. Okay, great. So let me keep going on here. And I want to kind of get into the intolerances. So this is a little more complex, right? Because people who have intolerances and they have a leaky gut and they got, the maldigestion going, those intolerances can be much more symptomatically problematic when their gut's not very healthy. Um, so it could be that you have an intolerance, say, to potatoes, and when, everything's really efficient and working well in your gut, you know, it having a little bit of potato is not going to bother things too much. Whereas if things are really unhealthy, fermenting poorly, all this and that, then they could bother you a lot more. So, that leaky gut thing still applies to intolerances. But generally, too, the actual intolerant foods, there's something about their building blocks, even their core molecular level nutrients, that I think for almost everybody with certain foods creates issues in our tissues and in our gut and our bloodstream. And so with those foods, I always use the term dose and frequency dependent. So we could take gluten or conventional modern wheat as an example. Many people are intolerant to that, and yet, if they have little traces, a couple of crackers here, a little, quarter cup of pasta there, it doesn't really bother them, or it's very minimally noticed, even, and they don't do it too frequently. So, so I think that dose and frequency dependence is a really key thing, especially because, say we determine you have 3 or 4 key intolerances, and you're like, oh gosh, I can't eat those for the rest of my life. I don't really look at it that way as much. If you have health issues that consuming that intolerant food is really contributing to, you get to make a choice about how much you want to mitigate the factor of that intolerance and how it's contributing to feeling unwell. So I'm really flexible with people in when we identify and understand these things to really acknowledge personal choice there. But again, I do feel like we are what we eat, and what we put in our body very much influences our well-being physiologically, mentally, and emotionally, even spiritually. So I like to get really individualized and specific and learn that process, because that's the epitome, of an individualized model of care. So then we get to the question of how do you identify, excuse me, how do you identify a food intolerance or a food allergy? And I have found that there's a lot of ways to go about learning these things. So I think it makes sense to start with honestly the most universal, what is called an elimination challenge. I am still willing to wager that this is the most efficient and surefire way to identify a food intolerance or a food allergy. And it kind of goes like it sounds. An elimination challenge is you eliminate a food for at least 6 weeks. It takes the inflammation response that a food causes at least 6 weeks to clear from your system. And then you challenge that food um, as reintroducing it to see if it elicits any symptoms in your body. And I mentioned many of the symptoms that could be possible, including the pulse check. Um, and that's a great way to identify food intolerances. Now, you can imagine that this gets a bit tricky if you got a really leaky gut or if you have multiple food intolerances and you reintroduce a food that you've eliminated after also consuming a bunch of other foods with that, then it's very possible that you will have a muddied picture of that intolerance. So for me, what I prefer when I'm doing an elimination challenge with someone is I prefer to do an actual full blown detox fast with someone and eliminate almost essentially all of the foods that one is likely to react to. And I usually do that over the course of a week or so. I start with a little bit of, highly restricted whole fruits and vegetables only diet for a few days. And then I evolve the person's approach to basically exclusively vegetable juices and fruit smoothies. And after that 7 or 8 or 9 day period, we start very carefully reintroducing foods. And we do them one at a time. If we really want to determine food intolerances, we really literally do them one at a time. So it's a tedious process. Or you can really pick out the most top 15 or 20 likely foods to have an intolerance or an allergy to, and kind of do those each one at a time. I think it's a great, great thing for everyone to try at some point in their life, because then you're not going off of a test, you're not going off of a theory, you're going off exactly what your body is communicating to you. And it makes it really abundantly clear. And I do a group fast. We're actually starting our fall detox here in a couple of weeks. I am always really just chuckle to be reminded of, when I reintroduce foods, when I do try things that I've now learned I'm intolerant to, sure enough, I get bloating or I get mucus coating in my throat or I get congestion in my sinuses. It's just, my body tells me. And so that's a really, really cool tool, and it's free, but it does take a lot of work and discipline. And so absolutely number one tool in my mind from a practicality standpoint. Not a lot of people might have the bandwidth, resources, or willingness to do that. And so then we start to talk about some of the other ways to ID, specifically food intolerances, although I do want to mention food allergies real quickly. So you can test for food allergies in a very straightforward way using antibodies. And you can draw basically some antibodies from taking a sample of blood and interacting those antibodies, whether you do a finger stick or an arm poke, and you can interact that blood with different antibodies to different food antigens. And if your blood has the antibodies, meaning the IgE antibodies, then that's going to show up in that chemical reaction and analysis. And so I'd rarely run an IgE antibody test for food allergies because usually the allergy is kind of somewhat obvious. However, there are places and times where maybe that would be appropriate. Now, if you go to a conventional doctor, people in the conventional medical world, and you go see even an allergist, the only type of food sensitivity or intolerance or allergy testing they will do is an IgE antibody. They claim that's the only one that's scientific. They don't even really grasp and understand the underpinnings of leaky gut and food intolerances and all of this stuff. They're just going to look for the antibodies, and if they find them, they'll tell you to avoid the food. I find that to be relatively rare, and I've seen plenty of people bring me back an allergy test that is negative when they have plenty of food intolerances as part of what's going on with them. But that's how you do the medical testing for IgEs. And yes, we can do that here at our clinic too. But again, it's rarely used. Now, with an intolerance, remember how I said there's different kinds of antibodies our body makes to different foods? Well, it turns out that when someone has an intolerance going on, they tend to make IgG antibodies, not IgE. And so there is a test, and there's a couple of companies we work with. One's called Allotest, the other's called US Biotech. These companies offer IgG food intolerance or allergy testing. And they test anywhere from 100 to 180 foods. And basically, you take a blood sample, either a finger stick or in the arm, send it off to the lab, and they turn around a report that shows degree of antibody activity. So, two things that are really important to understand the limitations of a test like that. Number one, three things. Number one, not all food intolerances are mediated through IgG. Our immune system is very complex. So, allergies and intolerances are mediated through all different types of pathways. So just looking for IgG doesn't assure you that you're identifying all intolerances. Number two, if you do an IgG antibody test, you are essentially testing the foods that are actively in your diet. If you haven't eaten wheat for a year and you don't show an IgG antibody to wheat, well, no surprise, even if you're intolerant to it, because you don't make antibodies long-term to the things that you're not exposing your body to. I mean, that's part of the thing again, right? With vaccines, why are we talking about boosters? Well, because the antibodies we've made from the injections are wearing off, and they wear off even faster with a vaccine versus if you get a virus out in nature. So if you're not eating a food, it's not really going to show up on that test. The third thing is, remember how we talked about most of the antibody responses are made when there's an underlying leaky gut process going on. You can make a little bit of an antibody response even with a healthy sealed up gut lining, but the folks that have a lot of intolerances are much more likely to have this leaky gut phenomenon happening. So to me, it always is a bit of a, kind of detective work to really interpret what is that result actually showing us. And then theoretically, if you do that test and you identify an intolerance, then you remove that food from your diet and you get the immune response to quiet down, you get the gut to heal back up, and then you may be able to, so you get your symptoms to resolve, and then you may be able to reintroduce that food in mild to moderate quantities without it disturbing or aggravating things. Usually that process takes a minimum of 3 months to do. So the place where I use that test is in a couple of places. First place is when a patient really insists. They say, I want to test for food intolerances and allergies. I don't want to do the elimination challenge. What test is there? And I say, okay, well, we have this test and I'm happy to run it, with those caveats I just shared with you. The other situation is when someone's symptoms aren't getting better from us working together and using all the other tools and knowledge and case taking to say, okay, well, what are we missing here? Maybe there's something going on that you're reacting to that we're missing that we haven't accounted for. And sometimes a test like that can turn things up. So I use it pretty infrequently. Some of the other doctors at my clinic use it a lot more. Many naturopaths use it. It's just a preferential thing. Now they're not cheap. They're between $150 and $200. And so, and again, right, they're just testing your gut at that moment. They're not telling you this information that forever will be true. I think the elimination challenge is a much more clear litmus test of that. Anywho, that's IgG, food intolerance testing, food sensitivity testing. I wanted to make sure to flush that out with people. There's also some other methodologies that are out there. There's all sorts of quote unquote muscle testing, energy testing. I'm not going to blanketly dismiss that type of tool. What I am going to say is that the skill set of the practitioner and the bias of the practitioner administering those tests does influence the results. So I tend to be a little more sciencey when I do this process, and I don't have a lot of training in those tools, so I do not utilize them. Although I've seen practitioners have great success that have really honed those skills. Another methodology is what's called the Carroll food testing. And Dr. Carroll was a naturopath, a kind of founder of our profession in America. And he actually, kind of our little region claim to fame, had his practice in Spokane in the early 1900s. And he used a radionics machine to test the blood of individuals and come up with the one or two main food intolerances that each individual has. I mentioned it, a few practitioners in our area do use it. I'm always curious when people share what their food intolerance test for Carroll is. But again, the practitioners, I believe, who are running that test are influencing it to some degree. So it's not my main methodology, but I did want to mention it. The method that I actually work most closely with is the blood type. Many of you have probably heard of the blood type diet. That's the popularized term. But the science of how blood type and food relationships are interrelated goes way back. It goes back over 100 years. It's in immunology textbooks from the early 1900s. And what we notice is that lots of foods have what are called lectins on their surfaces. Even when they're broken down, you still get some of these lectins hanging out on the surface of the foods you absorb. Those lectins can be pretty immunologically responsive. Remember what we talked about? Allergy and intolerance is really the immune system getting revved up around a food, seeing it as hostile. So these lectins that are unique to each food, it turns out, have differentiating responses based on a person's blood type. And again, there's a really good science behind this. This is not just a, theory with no backing. And so what I have found as a clinician is that the person and the guy who pioneered this and popularized this is called Peter D'Adamo. He's a naturopath, really brilliant guy. So he's developed, a book and lists and really comprehensive information to discern what type of immune response different people with different blood types have to all different foods. And that it turns out that, right, different foods for different blood types are seen as friendly versus unfriendly. And I've really enjoyed this approach, number one, because I get great results with my patients. I've found that people who really closely follow their blood type diet tend to feel a lot better, whatever their chief complaint they come in with is. I also feel that the science is pretty, clear and makes sense to me with the lectins and how they interface with the immune system. And I also have really noticed that for people to do the blood type diet, it's not overwhelming to most people, especially if they're serious about wanting to repair their health and do it through nutrition, that it's pretty accessible. And so a lot of times I don't need to test anybody unless they don't know their blood type, which is a $15 test. I just start with, hey, let's work off of what foods we know kind of by genetic design you more efficiently digest and your immune system's more friendly to. Now, I could get a little more complex here. The blood type diet is not just about the lectins and the immune response. It also has to do with stomach acidity and different, clinical and laboratory research we've done on a population-wide basis of people with different blood types and how their digestion works and what kind of diseases they're prone to and what type of enzymes their bodies make, this kind of thing. So there's more to it there. But in general, I think it's a tremendous tool. I've really found it to be helpful in my practice, and I always mention it. There is a more refined approach to blood type. It's called genotype. And that's where Dr. Diadamo has evolved more layers of assessment into dictating which foods more precisely are friendly or unfriendly to people's designs. There's a lot of biometric measurements. There's personal and family health histories incorporated. There's personality tests. There's a lot. The whole process goes into discerning the genotype, which is a more precise assessment and much more detailed. And we do that at the clinic. And just putting it out there, I really enjoy that. I kind of think that levels things up a little bit. So kind of circling through all that, I want to pause and say we're on our last few minutes here, so I want to leave a little space for questions. If anyone has any, to shoot them out there on the chat. And also mention that overarchingly, this process of discerning what foods are friendly and unfriendly, it is something that is really neglected in general in our culture. And I think that that's tragic to take that individualized approach away from us, because it really can help people. And whatever methodology you go at it with, whether you use the blood type, whether you use fasting and elimination challenge, whatever tool you choose, IgG testing, I just think that it's a really valuable thing to learn about yourself. And then you get to choose how much you want to engage with that, right? Dose and frequency dependent. So we're not making statements of rigidity and all or nothing here. We're really trying to paint a picture of, knowing oneself better. And I think naturopathically, more than anything, that's what I'm passionate about, is how can we more uniquely, more deeply understand ourselves on all levels? This is one facet of that. And in doing so, that turns us into our own doctors. And that is what our world needs. We don't need drugs and medicines. We don't really, need to take a whole lot of anything if our food and life is serving our greatest authentic good and equilibrium. And so that's really something that I think this conversation about food intolerances, allergies, just honors that principle. So before I break off, just one last question. Do I think that any food allergy can be reversed? Can be, yes, I think that that's a word I can say is true, although I've seen cases where we haven't got there, where we haven't got to the bottom of reversing a food allergy. So is it possible that a food allergy can't be reversed? For sure. But I feel like if people are really dedicated to the process, that we can get to the bottom of it and reverse them in most instances. Okay, any last questions from anybody before we click off here? Okay, well, hopefully if you're frantically typing, I'll catch that, but otherwise I'm going to stop the recording. And I'm going to thank you all for being here, and it's been a pleasure chatting with you today. Thanks so much.